Here's a number that'll stop you cold. In one Florida town, the violent crime rate is 20 times higher than the peaceful beaches just down the road. In another, nearly 1 in 3 people live in poverty. And there's a town literally named Beverly Hills. But trust me, there are no mansions, no movie stars, nothing you'd expect. Everybody sells you the same Florida. Palm trees, sunshine, postcard beaches. But nobody talks about the other Florida. The town's tourists speed past with the windows rolled up. Today we're counting down the 15 most hated towns in Florida, ranked by real FBI crime data and US Census numbers. Not opinions, facts. And number 2 will genuinely shock you. Its glamorous name hides a heartbreaking truth. Some of these places will surprise you. One might even be near you. Stick around till the end. Number 15, Perry. We kick things off deep in Florida's Nature Coast, in a town they proudly call the tree capital of the South. Perry sits about an hour southeast of Tallahassee, surrounded by pine forests and quiet backroads. On paper, it sounds like the kind of slow, simple life a lot of people say they're chasing. But scratch the surface, and Perry tells a much harder story. The real enemy here isn't crime, it's opportunity, or the total lack of it. Perry has leaned for generations on the timber and paper industry, and when that shrinks, the whole town feels it. Wages stay low, good jobs stay scarce, and young people who want a future often have no choice but to leave. That's the quiet tragedy of a town like this. It doesn't collapse in a dramatic way. It just slowly empties out. And then there's the safety issue. Locals who've reviewed life in Perry paint a rough picture. One longtime resident called it the first place they'd ever experienced a burglary, describing property crime as a constant background worry. It's the kind of place where people talk about locking up twice and keeping an eye on the street. Now, is Perry the most dangerous town on this list? Not even close. You'll see far scarier numbers ahead. But hated isn't only about violence. Sometimes it's about feeling stuck, trapped in a beautiful, sleepy town with nowhere to grow. Here's your takeaway, and it applies to every rural move you'll ever consider. Don't just ask, is it pretty? Ask the questions that actually matter. Where do people work? What is there to do? Are young families moving in whilst you're moving out? A town can have gorgeous scenery and still quietly suffocate your options. Perry is our gentle warning shot, a reminder that peace and quiet, taken too far, can start to feel a lot like being forgotten. And believe me, from here things only get more intense. Number 14, Cocoa. Next up is a town with a serious identity problem and a name that fools people constantly. Say Cocoa, and most folks instantly picture Cocoa Beach. Surfboards, sunburns, that famous pier. But inland Cocoa, the one sitting just across the water, is a completely different animal, and the data proves it. This is one of those places that keeps showing up year after year on Florida's most dangerous cities list. Its total crime rate sits well above the state average, and it's been named in recent statewide roundups alongside towns you'll meet later that have genuinely frightening reputations. For a place that shares a name with a tourist paradise, that's a jarring contrast. And that contrast is the whole point. On one side of the causeway, tourist dollars pour into beachfront hotels and souvenir shops. Just a few miles inland, certain neighborhoods deal with a very different reality. Higher crime, tighter budgets, and the kind of struggle the vacation brochures never mention. Same region, same zip code family, two completely separate worlds. What makes Cocoa especially tricky is how easy it is to get burned here. Imagine booking a cheap place online, seeing the word Cocoa, and assuming your steps from the surf. Then you arrive, and you're nowhere near that postcard beach, in a neighborhood the locals already know to avoid after dark. It happens more than you'd think. Here's your practical takeaway, and honestly, it might be the most useful tip in this entire video. In Florida, a 5-mile difference can be a different universe. Never trust a region's name to tell you whether an area is safe. Before you book a stay, sign a lease, or hand over a deposit, pull up the specific neighborhood's crime map. Not the cities, not the counties, the exact street. Cocoa isn't the worst place you'll see today. But it's the perfect example of Florida's biggest trick, the beautiful name that hides the rough reality. And trust me, that theme is about to come roaring back. Number 13, Fort Pierce. Now here's a town that genuinely complicates the story, and I want to be fair to it. Fort Pierce, sitting on Florida's Treasure Coast, is a place actively fighting to rewrite its own reputation. And by some measures, it's winning. City leaders proudly point to a 50% drop in overall crime since 2015, including a reported 33% reduction in violent crime. The mayor has publicly called it a safe city, and the numbers show real, measurable progress. That's not spin. That's a community rolling up its sleeves and clawing its way towards something better. So why on earth is it on a most hated list? Because reputation is stubborn. Even with all that improvement, Fort Pierce still carries a D-plus crime grade in independent rankings, placing it below average compared to similarly sized American cities. The scars of its rougher years haven't fully faded, and to a lot of outsiders, the old Fort Pierce is the only one they know. That gap between how far the town has come and how people still see it is exactly what lands it here. And that gap is where the real lesson lives. Fort Pierce is proof that a town's story isn't frozen in time. Places rise, places fall, and sometimes a place that's been written off is quietly turning a corner while nobody's paying attention. Here's your takeaway, and this one's especially valuable if you're house hunting or investing. Don't just look at where a town is. Look at where it's heading. A single crime statistic is a snapshot. The trajectory is the real story. A town showing a steady downward crime trend can actually be a smart, affordable bet before the prices catch up and everyone else notices. Fort Pierce earns its spot not because it's hopeless, but because perception hasn't caught up with progress. It's a town wearing an old reputation like a coat it's trying hard to take off. And as we climb higher on this list, that hope gets harder and harder to find. Number 12, Eatonville. This next one deserves a moment of genuine respect before we get to the hard numbers, because Eatonville isn't just any town. It holds a place in American history that almost nowhere else can claim. Founded in 1887, Eatonville is one of the oldest Black incorporated municipalities in the entire United States, and it's the hometown of legendary author Zora Neale Hurston. This is sacred ground, a place built on Black self-determination when that was almost unthinkable. That legacy is priceless. But modern life in Eatonville tells a painfully different story than its proud past. Because when you pull the recent data, Eatonville jumps out for all the wrong reasons. This small Central Florida town has posted one of the highest property crime rates in the entire state. Figures reported above 10,000 per 100,000 residents in some rankings. For a community this size, in this historically significant, those numbers are heartbreaking. It regularly appears on statewide most dangerous lists, sitting shoulder to shoulder with towns that have nowhere near its cultural importance. So what happened? How does a place this meaningful end up struggling this badly? The answer is the same quiet villain that haunts almost every town on this list: disinvestment. Decades of being overlooked, underfunded, and squeezed by development pressure from the booming Orlando metro around it. The problem was never the people. It was the money, the attention, and the opportunity that kept flowing everywhere except here. Here's your takeaway, and it's an important one. A town can be historically priceless and economically fragile at the exact same time. These two things are not contradictions. They're the direct result of who gets invested in and who gets left behind. Eatonville's struggles aren't a mark against its remarkable community. They're an indictment of everything that failed to show up for it. Remember that as we go, because it's the thread tying this whole list together. And from here on out, that thread pulls tighter, and the numbers get a whole lot scarier. Number 11, Riviera Beach. Get ready for one of the sharpest contradictions on this entire list, because Riviera Beach is gorgeous. We're talking prime Atlantic waterfront in Palm Beach County, sparkling marinas, boats bobbing in the sun, the kind of coastline that developers dream about. If you only saw a photo of the water here, you'd assume you were looking at pure Florida luxury. Then you look at the statistics, and the picture shatters. Riviera Beach carries a violent crime rate and a property crime rate far above the Sunshine State average, a dangerous combination that lands it on danger rankings again and again. And it's not random. It's tied tightly to a stubbornly high local poverty rate, the kind of deep economic struggle that no amount of beautiful scenery can paper over. Just blocks from million-dollar views, families are fighting to get by, and the crime numbers reflect that pressure. This is the cruel irony of a lot of coastal Florida. We're trained to believe that waterfront equals wealth, that if a place has a beach, it must be safe, expensive, and thriving. Riviera Beach blows that assumption to pieces. Here, some of the most stunning coordinates in the state sit right next to some of its toughest living conditions. The ocean doesn't care how much money you have. And in Riviera Beach, that gap between the view and the reality is enormous. Here's your takeaway, and it's a mindset shift that could genuinely protect you. Scenery is not a safety rating. When you're scouting a place to visit, live, or invest, never let a beautiful backdrop switch off your brain. Some of Florida's most photogenic locations hide its harshest realities. Look past the postcard. Check the crime map. Check the poverty data. Check the actual street, not the sunset. Riviera Beach is proof that paradise and struggle can share the same shoreline. And as we cross into the top 10, the beauty starts to fade, and the raw, hard numbers take over completely. Number 10, Lake Park. Welcome to the top 10, and welcome to a town that will completely rewire how you think about crime statistics. Lake Park is a tiny community in Palm Beach County, home to just a few thousand people. Blink while driving through, and you'd miss it entirely. So how does a town this small keep landing on the same most dangerous lists as sprawling Florida cities packed with hundreds of thousands of residents? That question is the whole reason Lake Park earns its spot, and the answer is a little terrifying. It comes down to a concept that trips people up constantly: crime rate versus crime count. When you have a small population but a high number of crimes, the number of incidents measured per 100,000 residents, absolutely explodes. Lake Park keeps appearing in statewide danger roundups precisely because of this brutal math. On paper, its raw numbers might look modest next to a big city. But spread across such a tiny population, the per capita reality becomes alarming. This is exactly the kind of place where people get fooled in the opposite direction. They see a small, sleepy-sounding town and assume small automatically means safe. Lake Park proves that assumption dead wrong. Sometimes the smaller the town, the more concentrated pests and more visible the danger becomes to the people living there. Here's your takeaway, and honestly, it's a skill that'll serve you for life whenever you research any town. Always demand your crime numbers per 100,000 residents. Never, and I mean never, judge a place by raw totals alone. A big city with 1,000 incidents can be far safer per person than a tiny town with 100. Without that per capita math, you will badly, dangerously misjudge a place. Lake Park is our warning that danger doesn't need a big population to be real. And from here, the towns don't just have bad rates. They have bad everything. The economic collapse is about to get very, very real. Number 9, Century. We're heading all the way up to the Panhandle now, to the very top edge of Florida, for a town whose name is dripping with irony, Century. It was founded with big dreams at the turn of a new century, a proud mill town with a purpose, a paycheck, and a future. Today, it's one of the most sobering stories in the entire state, because Century is what happens when the thing that built a town suddenly disappears. For generations, this town revolved around its mill. That industry was the heartbeat, the jobs, the wages, the reason people stayed. And then, like so many industrial towns across America, the work dried up. When the mill's role faded, it didn't just take jobs with it. It took the town's entire economic engine. What was left behind is genuinely staggering. Census data has ranked Century among the poorest places in the entire United States. One study reported a median household income of just $17,188 a year, a number so low it's hard to even process, with a poverty rate that has hovered around a punishing 22%. Sit with that for a second. This isn't a rough neighborhood in a big city. This is an entire town where the typical family is trying to survive on a fraction of what most Americans earn. The struggle here isn't a phase, it's the foundation. Here's your takeaway, and it's absolutely critical if you ever consider moving somewhere small and affordable. Before you commit, find out if the local economy depends on a single employer or a single industry. Because when that one thing leaves, and eventually it often does, everything goes with it. The jobs, the businesses, the young families, the future. A one-industry town is a house built on one leg. Century is the classic ghost of the company town after the company left. And believe it or not, the human cost is about to get even more raw. Because next, we meet the people who feed a nation. Number 8. Immokalee. This next one isn't just a town. It's a wake-up call that hits you square in the chest, especially the next time you sit down to eat. Meet Immokalee, an agricultural community tucked into the interior of Southwest Florida. You've almost certainly never been there, but there's a very real chance you've eaten food picked by its hands. Immokalee is one of the most important farming hubs in the country, the place that supplies a massive share of America's winter tomatoes and other produce. It is, quite literally, an engine that helps feed the nation. But that engine runs on the backs of migrant farm workers, and the way they live is where this story turns dark. The overwhelming majority of these workers live below the federal poverty line. We're talking families facing food insecurity, a bitter irony in a town that grows food for millions, alongside unaffordable housing and grueling labor. Workers endure long shifts in brutal Florida heat, and reporting on the community has documented harsh, sometimes exploitative working conditions that most of us can barely imagine. During the pandemic, Immokalee was hit especially hard, with crowded conditions fueling a disproportionate number of cases. So let me be crystal clear about why Immokalee is on this list. It's not here because its people are anything but hardworking and resilient. They're the opposite. It's here because the conditions are that severe, and because it represents a struggle most of Florida would rather not look at. Here's your takeaway, and it's less a life hack than a gut check. The cheap produce stacked in your grocery store has a human cost that rarely makes it onto the price tag. Immokalee forces us to see the people behind the food, the ones working the hardest for the least. Awareness is its own kind of respect. Immokalee stays with you. And as we push into the final 7, the numbers stop being about hardship alone and start becoming about outright danger. Number 7. Gifford. If you thought Century's poverty numbers were hard to hear, brace yourself, because Gifford may be the single most economically devastated town in the entire state of Florida. Not one of the worst. By at least one major measure, the worst. Full stop. Gifford is an unincorporated community on Florida's Treasure Coast, just north of Riviera Beach, close enough to touch some of the state's wealthier enclaves, yet living in a completely different economic universe. And when researchers combed through the data for nearly 600 Florida towns, Gifford didn't just rank badly. It ranked dead last, the poorest town in the entire state. The number behind that title is brutal. A typical Gifford household earns just around $22,353 a year. Read that again. That's the median, meaning half the households are pulling in even less than that. It's a fraction of the Florida median income, a level of deprivation that shapes every single part of daily life, from healthcare to housing to whether kids have a realistic shot at something better. And here's the part that matters most. Poverty this deep, this widespread, and this persistent isn't an accident. It isn't bad luck. It's generational, passed down through decades of being systematically overlooked, underfunded, and denied the investment that flowed so freely to the towns just down the road. Gifford didn't fail. It was failed. Here's your takeaway, and it's the thread that ties this entire list together. When you see poverty this entrenched, understand that the real story is almost always abandonment of opportunity, of infrastructure, of basic investment in people. The hate these towns attract is a symptom. The disease is what was taken away or never given in the first place. Gifford is Florida's rock bottom for income. But money isn't the only way a town can be pushed to the edge. Because from here on, we're entering the danger zone, where the crime statistics stop being concerning and start being genuinely shocking. Number 6, Mangonia Park. All right, take a breath, because this is where the numbers stop being sad and start being scary. Welcome to Mangonia Park, and prepare to have everything you assume about small-town safety completely demolished. Here's the setup. Mangonia Park is a microscopic town in Palm Beach County, home to only around 1,000 people. That's it. Smaller than many high schools. The kind of place you'd expect to be a quiet, forgettable dot on the map. Now here's the gut punch. Mangonia Park has posted one of the highest crime indexes in the entire state of Florida. The figures are genuinely staggering. Reports have shown over 6,000 victimizations per 100,000 people, paired with a violent crime rate soaring above 1,000 per 100,000. Some rankings have listed its overall crime index as the highest in the whole state. For a town this tiny, those aren't just bad numbers. They're the per capita equivalent of a full-blown crime wave crammed into a space you could drive across in 2 minutes. This is the terrifying real-world version of the lesson we learned back at Lake Park. When you have an extremely small population and a high volume of crime, the rate doesn't just climb, it detonates. Every incident carries enormous statistical weight when it's spread across so few residents, and it means the people who actually live in Mangonia Park are facing a density of danger most Americans in far bigger cities never experience. Here's your takeaway, delivered as bluntly as I can. Tiny does not mean safe. In fact, sometimes tiny is exactly what makes the danger so concentrated and so inescapable. Never let a small population lull you into a false sense of security. Do the math, check the rate, and let the data, not your assumptions, tell you the truth. Mangonia Park proves that some of Florida's most dangerous ground comes in the smallest packages. And we're not done, because the top 5 are about to combine that danger with heartbreak, starting with a town as beautiful as it is broken. Number 5. Opa-locka. Now we hit the top 5, and we begin with a town that is, without exaggeration, one of the most tragic contradictions in America. Opa-locka, a small city just north of Miami, is genuinely one of a kind. And that's not marketing, it's architecture. Founded in the 1920s, Opa-locka was built as a fantasy come to life, designed around a Moorish architectural theme inspired by 1001 Nights. We're talking domes, minarets, arched facades, and streets with names pulled straight from Arabian folklore. To this day, it holds the largest collection of Moorish revival architecture in the entire Western Hemisphere. Walking through parts of it feels like stepping into a storybook. It should be a treasured landmark. Instead, Opa-locka has become a national symbol of danger. Because the numbers here are devastating. Opa-locka has repeatedly been named one of the most dangerous cities, not just in Florida, but in the entire United States. It's carried a persistently high homicide rate for decades, a reputation for violence so entrenched that it has overshadowed all that stunning history. The fairy tale architecture still stands, but it now watches over streets shaped by crime, corruption scandals, and deep economic distress that the town has struggled for years to escape. That's what makes Opa-locka so heartbreaking. It has genuine cultural bones, real beauty, real uniqueness, real history worth celebrating. And yet none of it has been enough to outrun the systemic problems dragging it down. Here's your takeaway. Beautiful design cannot fix broken systems. Opa-locka is living proof that you can pour artistry and vision into a place, but if the jobs, the safety, and the investment never follow, the struggle wins. Beauty is a surface. Stability is a foundation, and a town needs the foundation to survive. Opa-locka is a masterpiece trapped in a crisis. And as we close in on the final 4, we return to a corner of Florida so troubled that the towns there have earned a chilling nickname all their own. Number 4, Pahokee. For our final 4, we travel to the shores of Lake Okeechobee, Florida's massive inland sea, and into a cluster of towns so troubled they've earned a grim collective nickname you'll hear in a moment. First up, Pahokee, a place so overlooked that locals themselves have called it the town that forgot. And the heartbreaking part? The data proves the nickname right. Pahokee's statistics are alarming on nearly every front. Its violent crime rate has hit roughly 2,025 incidents per 100,000 people, a figure reported as the second highest in the entire state of Florida. Let that sink in. Out of every town, city, and community across this enormous state, Pahokee has ranked number 2 for violent crime. And that danger doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's welded to severe grinding poverty, driven by the slow collapse of the stable agricultural work that this whole region was built on. For generations, the land around the lake meant farm jobs. But as that industry shifted and shrank, the towns that depended on it were left stranded, economically gutted, physically isolated, and increasingly forgotten by the rest of the state speeding along the coasts. Pahokee is what's left when the work leaves, but the people can't. Here's your takeaway, and it's a pattern recognition skill worth carrying with you. When you see multiple failing towns clustered together in the same area, the cause is almost never one town's individual failure. It's regional economic collapse. an entire zone abandoned at once. These places didn't fall apart separately. They fell together for the same reasons. Pahokee and its neighbors form what locals grimly call the muck cities, named for the rich black soil that made others rich while leaving the residents behind. It's one of the toughest corners in all of Florida. And Pahokee is only number 4, because right next door sits its neighbor, a town whose name became infamous across the entire nation. That's next. Number 3, Belle Glade. Right next door to Pahokee, on that same troubled shore of Lake Okeechobee, sits what may be the most notorious town on this entire list, Belle Glade. They call this sugar country. The surrounding fields fuel a massive, immensely profitable sugar industry. But here's the bitter truth Belle Glade has lived with for decades. The sweetness never reached the people who live here. The numbers are among the worst in the nation. Belle Glade has carried a poverty rate reported near 39%, meaning close to 4 out of every 10 residents live below the poverty line. That's not just bad for Florida. That's one of the most severe poverty rates in the entire United States. Layered on top of that is a sky-high crime rate, creating the kind of compounding struggle that traps generations. But what truly seared Belle Glade into the national consciousness was a public health catastrophe. In the 1980s, this small town developed one of the highest HIV rates in the entire country, a devastating crisis that made national headlines and stained its reputation for years. It became a symbol, unfairly reduced to its worst statistics while the deeper causes went ignored. And those causes are the whole point. Belle Glade is the textbook case of a community left behind by an industry that grew rich off its land while the workers stayed poor. The profits flowed out. The hardships stayed in. That's not a coincidence. It's the entire structure of the place. Here's your takeaway, and I want you to really hold on to it. Remember Belle Glade the next time someone tells you poverty is simply about not trying hard enough. The people here work brutally hard, surrounded by billion-dollar fields, and still can't get ahead. That tells you the problem was never effort. It was a system built to profit off them, not for them. Belle Glade is Florida's most heartbreaking example of wealth and poverty growing side by side. And now, the moment you've been waiting for. Number 2 is going to genuinely shock you. Number 2, Beverly Hills, Florida. Here it is, the one I promised would stop you cold. Close your eyes and say the words, Beverly Hills. What do you see? Mansions behind iron gates, palm-lined boulevards, movie stars, luxury cars, the single most glamorous zip code in all of America. That name is shorthand for wealth. Now open your eyes, because Beverly Hills, Florida is one of the most economically struggling towns in the entire country. Same name. Complete opposite reality. Tucked into Citrus County on Florida's Gulf side, this Beverly Hills is a community of roughly 9,000 people, and it has been ranked among the worst places to live in the entire nation. The data behind that ranking is genuinely jarring. One major study found a poverty rate around 32.9%, placing it squarely in the top 10% poorest communities in America. Nearly a third of the town living below the poverty line. And the housing? A reported median home value near $63,400, landing it in the bottom 10% nationally. Think about the sheer whiplash of that. There's a Beverly Hills where a modest home costs tens of millions. And there's this Beverly Hills where the typical home is worth less than a luxury SUV in the other one. 2 towns, one name, universes apart. That is exactly why this entry stops people in their tracks. Your brain hears the name and fills in a fantasy that reality then demolishes. Here's your takeaway, and it might be the single most practical lesson in this whole video. Never, ever judge a town by its name. The most aspirational, glamorous label in America is stapled onto one of Florida's most economically fragile communities. Names are marketing, names are history, names are hope, but names are not data. Always, always do the homework instead of trusting the assumption. Beverly Hills, Florida is the ultimate reminder that appearances lie. And after all of that, after every shocking number, one town still stands above them all. The number 1 most hated town in Florida is next. Number 1, Florida City. And here we are, the number 1 most hated town in Florida, the one that sits at the very top of nearly every danger ranking the state produces. Ladies and gentlemen, Meet Florida City. If you've ever driven down to the Florida Keys, there's a good chance you've passed straight through it without even realizing. Florida City is the gateway town to the Keys, the last real stop before that famous overseas highway carries you off toward turquoise water and island paradise. Millions of tourists blow through here every single year, windows up, eyes on the horizon, never once glancing at the town they're speeding past. And what they're missing is staggering, because Florida City has repeatedly recorded the highest violent crime rate in all of Florida, a rate reported around a jaw-dropping 2,290 incidents per 100,000 residents. That's not just the worst in the state. It's landed Florida City on lists of the most dangerous cities in the entire United States. Number one in Florida, and a serious contender for one of the most dangerous small cities in the country. For a place most people only know as a gas-and-go pit stop, those numbers are almost impossible to believe. And that, right there, is the perfect and painful summary of this entire list. Florida City is a place people drive past, but never actually look at. It's the ultimate symbol of everything we've talked about today: communities rendered invisible, hidden in plain sight, just off the road to paradise. Here's your final takeaway, and it's the heart of this whole video. Hated was never really the right word. The true theme connecting all 15 of these towns isn't hatred. It's being overlooked, forgotten, ignored by the investment, the attention, and the opportunity that flowed everywhere else. That neglect is what shows up years later as the numbers you've heard today. Florida City tops the list not because it's the most talked about, but because it's the most unseen. So there you have it, the 15 most hated towns in Florida, ranked not by rumor or opinion, but by cold, hard data pulled from FBI crime reports and U.S. Census figures. But before you close this video, I want to leave you with the one thought that matters most. Behind every single statistic we covered today is a real community of real people. Neighbors, workers, families, kids, many of them fighting incredibly hard against conditions they did not create and did not choose. These towns aren't villains. In most cases, they're the ones who got left behind. And that's a very different story than the clickbait usually tells. Now, I genuinely want to hear from you. Have you ever lived in, worked in, or driven through any of these towns? Was the reality better than the numbers, or honestly worse? Was there kindness and community the statistics could never capture? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and your first-hand experience is worth more than any spreadsheet. If this video opened your eyes even a little, do me a quick favor. Smash that like button, hit subscribe so the next deep dive lands right in your feed, and go check out our companion video on the safest, most underrated small towns in Florida. The hopeful flip side of everything you just watched. It's popping up on your screen right now. And one last important note, a quick disclaimer. This video is for informational and educational purposes, built on publicly available crime and census data. Those statistics shift from year to year. They never tell the full story of any place, and nothing here is a judgment of the good people who call these towns home. Always do your own current research before visiting, moving, or making any decision about a community. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. Now go take a closer look at the world you've been driving past, and I'll see you in the next one.